The school auditorium buzzed with the electric excitement of the holiday season. Parents gathered in the rows of folding chairs, some holding steaming cups of coffee, others juggling toddlers and strollers. On the stage, a tangle of kids rehearsed their final lines for the annual Christmas play. For many in the community, this event was a cherished tradition, a chance to watch their children shine under the bright stage lights, representing the joy of the season. Tanya Williams sat toward the middle of the room, her phone balanced on her lap as she captured snippets of her daughter Ava practicing. Ava, an energetic and imaginative 8-year-old with a love for all things dramatic, had been rehearsing tirelessly for her role. She was cast as one of the wise men, a significant part of the play that required her to wear a flowing gold robe and carry a decorative gift box to the baby Jesus. Ava had proudly recited her lines over breakfast, in the car, and during bedtime stories. "She's ready to steal the show," Tanya had told her best friend Jasmine over the phone the night before. Jasmine, ever the cheerleader, had laughed and said, "You'll have to fight off Broadway scouts after tonight." Now Tanya watched Ava on stage, her daughter's robe slightly oversized but perfectly regal. The sight filled Tanya with pride. She had always emphasized the importance of hard work and self-confidence to Ava, and this play was an opportunity for her to shine. But as the students began arranging themselves into their starting positions, Tanya noticed a flurry of hushed conversation at the side of the stage. The school principal, Mrs. Blake, stood with a clipboard in hand, her expression sharp and scrutinizing. She leaned down to whisper something to one of the teachers, who then pointed in Ava's direction. Tanya felt a prickle of unease. Moments later, Mrs. Blake approached the stage, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. The microphone squealed as Mrs. Blake adjusted it. "Excuse me, everyone," she said, her voice brisk and authoritative. "Before we begin the final rehearsal, I have an announcement." Her gaze swept the room before landing on Ava. "Ava, could you step forward, please?" Tanya leaned forward in her seat, her motherly instincts tingling. Ava hesitated, looking back at her teacher, who nodded encouragingly. She stepped forward, her small hands clutching the gift box propped tightly. Mrs. Blake cleared her throat. "Ava," she began, "we've had a change in casting. Unfortunately, we'll need you to step aside from your role as a wise man. We believe a different student would be more suited to the part." Ava's face fell, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Blake's smile tightened. "Well, we want the play to reflect a certain tradition, and it's important to keep the roles authentic." The words struck like a blow, their meaning loud and clear despite the careful phrasing. Tanya sat up straighter, her heart pounding. Ava, a bright-eyed black girl with tight curls and an infectious laugh, was being told she didn't fit the image of a wise man. The room grew silent, the chatter of parents fading as they sensed the tension brewing. Tanya stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the stillness. All eyes turned toward her, and Mrs. Blake hesitated, visibly caught off guard by the challenge. "We're simply making some adjustments," Mrs. Blake said, a note of condescension slipping into her tone. "I'm sure you understand." "No, I don't," Tanya shot back. "Ava's been practicing for weeks. What possible reason could there be to remove her from the role?" Mrs. Blake shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the gathering audience. "We'll discuss this after the rehearsal," she said firmly, clearly wanting to avoid a scene. But Tanya wasn't backing down. "No, we'll discuss it now," she said, her voice unwavering. "Is this how we treat our kids? By teaching them they're not good enough because of how they look?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some parents exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable, while others whispered in hushed tones of support. Mrs. Blake pursed her lips and gestured for the rehearsal to continue, brushing past Tanya as if the confrontation had ended. Ava returned to her mother's side, tears brimming in her wide brown eyes. "I don't understand, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did I do something wrong?" Tanya knelt, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong, and we're not going to let anyone make you feel like you did." That evening, as Ava slept, Tanya sat at the dining room table, her laptop open and her phone buzzing with messages. She had already shared the incident on her social media accounts, and the responses were pouring in. Friends, family, and even acquaintances expressing outrage and support. "This isn't just about the play," Tanya typed in one post. "This is about teaching our kids that they matter, no matter what anyone says." The next day, Tanya reached out to Maya Hernandez, another parent whose son had been overlooked for a lead role despite his talent. Together, they began piecing together stories of similar instances of bias and exclusion that painted a troubling picture of the school's practices. Tanya also contacted a local journalist known for covering issues of discrimination in education, determined to bring the story to light. By the time Tanya arrived at the school to meet with Mrs. Blake and the school board, she was armed with evidence, community support, and a fierce determination. This wasn't just about Ava's role in the Christmas play anymore. It was about demanding accountability and ensuring no other child had to face what Ava had endured. Tanya drove Ava to school the next morning, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. Ava sat quietly in the back seat, her usual chatter replaced by a distant stare out the window. Tanya glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror, her heart breaking at the sight of Ava's dimmed enthusiasm. "Sweetheart," Tanya began, breaking the silence, "do you remember what we talked about last night? About how this isn't your fault?" Ava nodded slowly, her hands fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. "But why does Mrs. Blake think I can't do it?" she asked softly. "I worked really hard, Mom. I even memorized all my lines." Tanya pulled the car into a parking spot and turned to face her daughter. "Sometimes, people have ideas about what someone should look like to do certain things, but those ideas are wrong. You're smart, talented, and you belong on that stage just as much as anyone else." Ava gave a small smile, though her eyes still carried doubt. Tanya leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "You go in there and hold your head high, okay? I'll handle the rest." As Ava disappeared into the school building, Tanya pulled out her phone and began making calls. She had spent the night researching local advocacy groups and reaching out to other parents, determined to turn this into a teachable moment for the entire school. One call stood out, a conversation with a representative from a national organization that focused on promoting equity in education. The representative not only validated Tanya's concerns, but also offered resources and support to help address the issue. The school itself was a reflection of the small town it served, a sprawling red brick building surrounded by fields and a weathered playground. Inside, the halls were lined with festive decorations, paper snowflakes, garlands, and colorful student-made ornaments. At first glance, it seemed like an idyllic place for children to learn and grow. But as Tanya walked through the corridors, she couldn't help noticing the subtle inequities that seemed to permeate the school environment. The pictures on the walls mostly featured the same few students, all of whom shared similar backgrounds. The trophies in the display cases highlighted achievements from decades ago, with few recent additions, and as she passed the auditorium, she overheard snippets of conversation that reminded her of the uphill battle she faced. "She's overreacting," one teacher whispered to another. "It's just a school play. Can you blame Mrs. Blake?" the other replied. "She's just trying to avoid controversy. These things can get so messy." Tanya paused, her jaw tightening. She knew that if she didn't act decisively, Ava's experience would be dismissed as an isolated incident. Later that afternoon, Tanya met with Maya Hernandez in the library. Maya, a warm and fiercely protective mother of 3, had a folder stuffed with documents, emails, meeting notes, and even photos from past events that painted a clear picture of bias. "My son Carlos is in the choir," Maya explained, pulling out a photo of her son standing at the far end of a group of kids. "He has one of the best voices in the school, but he's never given solos. It's always the same kids getting the spotlight." Tanya nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "It's not just about Ava then," she said. "This is part of a bigger problem." "Exactly," Maya said. "And if we don't stand up to it now, nothing will change." The two mothers began drafting a letter to the school board, outlining specific incidents and calling for immediate action. They also decided to organize a meeting with other concerned parents to gather more stories and build a stronger case. Meanwhile, Ava's teacher, Mrs. Fields, noticed the shift in her students' demeanor. Kind and empathetic educator, Mrs. Fields had always encouraged Ava to embrace her creativity and express herself. Seeing Ava subdued during class was deeply troubling. During recess, Mrs. Fields approached Ava as she sat on a bench, her lunch untouched. "Hey, Ava," she said gently, sitting down beside her. You've been a little quiet today. Is everything okay? Ava hesitated before answering. I don't think Mrs. Blake likes me, she admitted. Mrs. Fields frowned, her heart aching for the little girl. Why would you think that? Ava shrugged. She said I couldn't be a wise man because I don't look right. But my mom says I can be anything I want to be. Mrs. Fields smiled softly. Your mom's right. And for what it's worth, I think you were doing an amazing job in that role. Ava's face brightened slightly, and Mrs. Fields made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Blake about the situation. She knew it wasn't her place to overstep, but she couldn't stay silent when one of her students was being treated unfairly. As word of the incident spread, Tanya found herself both supported and criticized by the community. Some parents reached out privately, sharing similar concerns and thanking her for speaking up. Others accused her of making a mountain out of a molehill, insisting that the Christmas play was meant to be a light-hearted tradition, not a battleground for social issues. One parent, Mr. Jeffries, even confronted Tanya in the parking lot after school. You're blowing this way out of proportion, he said, his tone accusatory. This is supposed to be about the kids, not your personal agenda. Tanya squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze with calm determination. It is about the kids, she replied. It's about making sure every child feels valued and included. If that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe it's time to rethink what this play really stands for. Mr. Jeffries muttered something under his breath and walked away, but Tanya didn't let the exchange rattle her. She knew she was on the right side of this fight. By the end of the week, Tanya and Maya had gathered enough stories and signatures to demand a formal meeting with the school board. They also reached out to the local news station, which agreed to cover the story. As Tanya prepared for the meeting, she felt a surge of determination. This isn't just about Ava anymore, she told Maya. This is about creating a better environment for all of our kids. The night of the school board meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. The library had been cleared to make space for the large crowd that had gathered. Parents, teachers, community members, and even a local journalist with a camera crew. Tanya sat in the front row beside Maya, clutching the folder containing their evidence and notes. Ava was at home with Jasmine, who had volunteered to babysit so Tanya could focus entirely on the task at hand. Mrs. Blake entered the room with 2 board members trailing behind her, their expressions neutral yet guarded. She avoided eye contact with Tanya as she took her seat at the head of the long table. Tanya noticed how carefully Mrs. Blake adjusted her papers, as if focusing on small tasks might shield her from the scrutiny of the room. The board chair, an older man with silver hair and a practiced smile, called the meeting to order. We're here tonight to address concerns raised by Ms. Tanya Williams regarding recent events in the school's holiday program, he announced. Ms. Williams, you have the floor. Tanya stood, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She glanced around the room, noting the mix of expressions, some supportive, some skeptical, and others indifferent. Taking a deep breath, she began. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, she said. I'm here tonight not just as a mother, but as a voice for every child who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. She recounted the incident with Ava, describing the humiliation her daughter had faced, and the principal's refusal to provide a clear explanation. As she spoke, she gestured to Maya, who handed out copies of their letter to the board members and key attendees. The letter outlined specific examples of exclusionary practices, including testimonies from other parents. It's not just about my daughter being removed from her role, Tanya continued. It's about a pattern of decisions that send a message to children of color that they're not good enough. That message is unacceptable, and it has no place in our schools. The room was silent as Tanya finished, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. The board chair cleared his throat. Thank you, Miss Williams. We'll now open the floor for discussion. Mrs. Blake was the first to respond. She began with a carefully rehearsed statement about the school's commitment to diversity and inclusion. This has been a misunderstanding, she said, her tone smooth but defensive. Our goal was never to exclude Ava or anyone else. The changes to the cast were made to reflect the historical accuracy of the nativity story. Tanya couldn't hold back. Historical accuracy? She interjected, her voice sharp. This is a Christmas play put on by elementary school kids. Since when does historical accuracy matter more than inclusion? A ripple of agreement swept through the audience, and Mrs. Blake's composure faltered. She hesitated before continuing. We didn't mean for this to cause harm, she said, but her words felt hollow. Maya stood next, her voice steady but firm. Harm was caused, whether it was intentional or not. This isn't just about the play. It's about a culture in this school that prioritizes certain students while sidelining others. She gestured to Carlos, who sat quietly in the audience. My son has been overlooked for opportunities time and time again, despite his talents. And he's not the only one. One by one, other parents began to speak up. A mother shared how her daughter had been discouraged from trying out for the school's debate team because the teacher said she didn't fit the mold. A father recounted how his son had been reprimanded more harshly than his peers for the same minor infractions. The stories painted a clear and troubling picture, and Tanya felt a surge of both validation and anger. As the discussion continued, the journalist from the local news station filmed quietly from the back of the room, capturing every moment. Tanya knew that this exposure would be a double-edged sword. While it would bring attention to the issue, it also meant opening herself and Ava up to public scrutiny. When the board chair finally called for a recess, Tanya stepped outside for fresh air. Maya followed, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're doing great, Maya said. They can't ignore this anymore. Tanya nodded, though her heart was still pounding. I just want Ava to know that her voice matters, that standing up for what's right is worth it. The meeting resumed with the board pledging to investigate the allegations and work toward solutions. But Tanya wasn't satisfied with vague promises. She pressed for concrete steps: a review of school policies, mandatory diversity training for staff, and the establishment of a committee to ensure equity in school activities. Mrs. Blake looked increasingly uncomfortable as Tanya laid out her demands. We're willing to make changes, the principal said, her tone tinged with resignation. But these things take time. Time isn't an excuse for inaction, Tanya replied. Every day that passes without change is another day our kids are made to feel like they don't belong. That's unacceptable. By the end of the meeting, the board had agreed to form a committee to address the issues raised, with Tanya and Maya as parent representatives. The local journalist approached Tanya afterward, asking for an interview. Tanya hesitated, knowing the risks of putting her family in the spotlight, but ultimately agreed. This isn't just my story, she told the reporter. It's the story of every child who has ever been told they're not enough. I want people to know that change is possible, but only if we're willing to fight for it. At home that evening, Tanya found Ava waiting for her in the living room, her eyes filled with curiosity. How did it go, Mom? She asked. Tanya knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly. It went well, she said. We're going to make things better, not just for you, but for everyone. Ava smiled, her confidence slowly returning. Can I still practice my lines? She asked. Of course, baby, Tanya said, her heart swelling with pride. Your story isn't over yet. Over the next few weeks, the school became a hive of activity. Tanya and Maya worked tirelessly to prepare for the first meeting of the newly formed Equity Committee, gathering input from parents and drafting a list of immediate changes they wanted to see. The school board's promise to address systemic issues was progress, but Tanya knew that promises alone wouldn't create lasting change. Meanwhile, the Christmas play rehearsals continued under a cloud of tension. Mrs. Blake's decision to quietly recast Ava's role had drawn backlash from several parents, some of whom had no issue with Ava's original casting and felt the entire ordeal had been unnecessary. Whispers of frustration circulated in the hallways, and the once joyful atmosphere of the holiday season began to feel tainted. During one of the committee's informal parent meetings, Maya's son Carlos stepped forward hesitantly, holding a crumpled sheet of paper. At 12 years old, he was reserved, rarely speaking in public. Yet something about the energy in the room, a collective determination to demand change, seemed to embolden him. Can I say something? He asked softly, his eyes darting between Maya and Tanya. Of course, Tanya said, giving him an encouraging nod. Carlos unfolded his paper and took a deep breath. I've always been scared to talk about this, but I want to sing, he began, his voice shaking slightly. Every time I try out for something at school, I feel like I'm not good enough. They never pick me, and I don't know if it's because I'm not what they want or if it's something else. But I've been practicing. I just want a chance. The room fell silent as Carlos's words settled over the group. Maya reached out and squeezed her son's hand, tears welling in her eyes. Tanya leaned forward, her voice steady and full of conviction. Carlos, you have an incredible gift, and you deserve to share it with the world. If this school won't give you a platform, then we'll find one for you. That evening, Tanya and Maya began brainstorming ways to highlight the talents of students like Carlos, those who had been overlooked or sidelined for far too long. Their initial idea of creating a small showcase quickly snowballed into something larger, an alternative holiday concert featuring students who had been underrepresented in school events. Not everyone in the community supported the Equity Committee's efforts or the idea of a separate concert. A small but vocal group of parents accused Tanya and Maya of stirring up trouble and undermining tradition. "This is political," one parent said at a school PTA meeting. "We've been doing the Christmas play the same way for years. Why is it suddenly a problem?" Tanya didn't flinch. "Because it's not just about the play," she replied. "It's about creating a school environment where every child feels seen, valued, and included. Traditions are important, but so is progress." Surprisingly, some unexpected allies emerged in support of Tanya's cause. Mrs. Fields, Ava's teacher, began incorporating lessons about diversity and representation into her classroom activities, gently encouraging her students to think critically about the stories they told and the people they included. Even some members of the school's teaching staff, initially wary of the changes being proposed, began to see the value in what Tanya and Maya were advocating for. One music teacher volunteered to help organize the alternative concert, offering to coach Carlos and a group of other students who had been overlooked in the past. Through it all, Ava's spirit began to reignite. Inspired by her mother's unwavering fight, she threw herself back into rehearsing her lines from the original play, even though she was no longer in the cast. One evening, as Tanya worked late at the dining table, Ava walked in wearing her gold robe. "Mom," she said confidently, "can I show you something?" Tanya set down her papers and watched as Ava performed her lines with passion and precision, her small frame radiating an energy that filled the room. When she finished, Tanya applauded with tears in her eyes. "You're amazing," Tanya said. "No one can take that away from you." Ava grinned. "Do you think I can perform at the concert you're planning?" Tanya smiled. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to." The first official meeting of the Equity Committee was held in the school's cafeteria, and the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Parents from diverse backgrounds shared stories of their children's struggles, their voices blending into a chorus of shared frustration and hope. One father, an immigrant from Ghana, spoke about his daughter's experiences. "She's always been one of the top students in her class, but when it comes to leadership roles, she's overlooked. It's as if her achievements don't matter as much." Another parent, a single mother of 3, recounted how her son was disproportionately disciplined compared to his peers. "It's like he's seen as a troublemaker before he even gets a chance," she said, her voice breaking. The stories were sobering but galvanizing, providing a clear mandate for the committee's work. By the end of the meeting, the group had drafted an action plan that included revising casting policies for school events, implementing diversity training for staff, and creating a mentorship program for students like Carlos. As Christmas approached, the alternative holiday concert began to take shape. Held in the town's community center, the event was open to all but focused on showcasing the talents of students who had been marginalized in traditional school programs. Carlos performed a stunning solo that brought the audience to its feet. Ava delivered her lines from the Christmas play with so much heart that several parents remarked how much they regretted not seeing her on the school stage. The night ended with a group performance of "This Little Light of Mine," a song chosen by Tanya for its message of resilience and hope. The concert was more than a success. It was a revelation. It showed the community what could be achieved when children were given the opportunity to shine, free from bias or exclusion. The push for change wasn't over, but the momentum was undeniable. Tanya knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. The community was beginning to see the value of inclusion, and Ava's light was shining brighter than ever. The weeks following the alternative holiday concert were a whirlwind of emotions and progress. Social media lit up with videos and photos from the event, accompanied by captions like, "Finally, every child gets a chance to shine," and "Proud to be part of a community that values inclusion." Ava's performance in particular struck a chord with viewers. Tanya received messages from parents across the town, and even beyond, sharing their own experiences with exclusion and bias in schools. But not everyone celebrated the concert's success. A few vocal critics doubled down, accusing Tanya and the Equity Committee of being divisive and ruining the magic of Christmas. Some members of the PTA called for the committee to be disbanded, arguing that its actions were unnecessary and disruptive. The most surprising backlash came from Mrs. Blake herself. She had kept a relatively low profile since the school board meeting, but resurfaced with an email to the community, framing herself as a defender of tradition. In her carefully worded message, she claimed that the controversy surrounding the play had been blown out of proportion and hinted that the Equity Committee was overstepping its bounds. Tanya read the email twice, her anger simmering. She recognized Mrs. Blake's tactics for what they were, an attempt to discredit the committee and undermine its momentum. Tanya knew she needed to act quickly to counter this narrative. That evening, as Tanya prepared a statement to address Mrs. Blake's email, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made her pause. Mrs. Fields. "Tanya, I hope I'm not calling too late," Mrs. Fields began, her voice hesitant but warm. "Not at all," Tanya replied. "What's on your mind?" "I wanted to apologize," Mrs. Fields said. "I should have spoken up earlier. What happened to Ava was wrong, and I can't stay silent anymore." Tanya's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Your support means more than you know." "I've been speaking with some of the other teachers," Mrs. Fields continued. "Many of us feel the same way, but we're afraid of retaliation. Mrs. Blake has made it clear that she doesn't want us stirring the pot." Tanya frowned. "No one should feel afraid to stand up for what's right. What if we create a safe space for teachers to share their concerns, anonymously, if necessary?" Mrs. Fields hesitated, then said, "That could work. I'll help spread the word." With Mrs. Fields' help, Tanya organized a series of confidential listening sessions for teachers. These meetings revealed a deeper, more troubling pattern of behavior from Mrs. Blake. Teachers described how she routinely dismissed their suggestions for more inclusive practices, and how students from underrepresented backgrounds were often overlooked for awards, advanced classes, and leadership roles. One teacher shared a particularly shocking story about a black student who had been disciplined for disruptive behavior after asking questions about racial representation in the school curriculum. She made it clear that certain topics were off limits, the teacher said. Tanya and Maya documented these accounts, carefully anonymizing them to protect the teachers who had come forward. Armed with this new evidence, they prepared for the next Equity Committee meeting, knowing it could be the most pivotal yet. The meeting was tense from the start. Mrs. Blake, visibly defensive, arrived with a folder of her own and a prepared statement. She began by accusing the committee of unfairly targeting her and sowing division within the school. "This has gone too far," Mrs. Blake declared, her voice rising. "We all want what's best for the students, but this constant criticism is damaging our community." Tanya waited until Mrs. Blake finished before standing. Her voice was calm but firm as she said, "What's damaging our community is a lack of accountability. This isn't about personal attacks. It's about creating a school where every child feels valued." She opened the folder she had brought, revealing pages of testimony from parents, students, and teachers. "These are their stories," she said, holding up the stack of papers, "and they paint a clear picture. This school has a culture that prioritizes the comfort of a few at the expense of many." The room fell silent as Tanya read excerpts from the testimonies. The accounts were raw and undeniable, shining a light on years of inequity that could no longer be ignored. Mrs. Blake's composure began to crack. "These are just opinions," she said weakly. "You can't take them at face value." Tanya met her gaze. When dozens of voices are saying the same thing, it's no longer just opinion. It's evidence. By the end of the meeting, the tide had shifted. The school board voted unanimously to initiate an independent review of the school's practices, including Mrs. Blake's leadership. They also approved several of the Equity Committee's proposals, including mandatory diversity training for staff and a review of disciplinary policies. For the first time, Tanya felt the weight of the fight begin to lift. Progress was being made, not just for Ava, but for every student who had been made to feel invisible. The following week, Tanya surprised Ava with a special announcement. "You're performing at the school assembly," she said, grinning. Ava's eyes widened. "Really? But I thought Mrs. Blake wouldn't let me. Tanya knelt down and took her daughter's hands. Sometimes we have to fight for our opportunities. And sometimes when we fight hard enough, we win. On the day of the assembly, Ava walked onto the stage wearing her gold robe, her head held high. She recited her lines flawlessly, her voice strong and clear. The audience erupted into applause, and Ava beamed, her confidence fully restored. In that moment, Tanya knew the fight had been worth it. The fallout from the Equity Committee's actions rippled through the school and the wider community. For many, the changes represented long overdue progress. For others, it stirred resentment and discomfort. Tanya quickly learned that fighting for equity came with consequences, both personal and professional. The independent review of the school's policies uncovered numerous systemic issues. Among them were disparities in disciplinary actions, favoritism in extracurricular activities, and a lack of training for staff on how to handle sensitive cultural and racial matters. The findings were damning, and the report became the foundation for a new wave of reforms. The most significant consequence of the review came in the form of Mrs. Blake's removal as principal. The decision was announced during a school board meeting, and the news sent shockwaves through the community. She resigned to pursue other opportunities, the board chair said diplomatically, though it was clear to everyone that her departure had been inevitable. While some parents expressed relief, others, particularly those who had supported Mrs. Blake, were vocal in their discontent. "This is a witch hunt," one parent said angrily during a PTA meeting. "Mrs. Blake cared about this school. She didn't deserve this." Tanya, who was in attendance, stood to address the comment. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," she said. "It's about building a better future for all of our children. Leadership is about accountability, and when someone's actions or inactions harm students, there must be consequences." The room fell silent, and while some parents remained unconvinced, Tanya's calm resolve earned her respect. The reforms began almost immediately. The school introduced a new principal, Dr. Elise Carter, who had a reputation for championing diversity and inclusion in her previous district. Within weeks of her arrival, Dr. Carter implemented several changes. A new policy ensured that all students had equal access to leadership roles, auditions, and extracurricular opportunities. Teachers underwent mandatory training on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. A mentorship program was launched, pairing older students with younger ones to foster a sense of belonging and mutual support. Ava's teacher, Mrs. Fields, embraced the changes wholeheartedly. She introduced a new curriculum unit focused on the contributions of diverse historical figures, and Ava's class became a space where discussions about inclusion and fairness were encouraged. Ava thrived in this environment. Her confidence soared, and she began taking on more responsibilities in school. When her classmates suggested putting on a student-led spring play, Ava volunteered to direct, eager to help others feel as included as she now did. Despite the positive strides, not everyone was on board with the changes. A group of disgruntled parents formed a coalition, calling themselves Preserve Tradition, and began lobbying the school board to reverse some of the new policies. "They're taking things too far," said one coalition member during a town hall. "This school has always been a place where kids can enjoy their childhood. Now it's all politics and no fun." Tanya and Maya attended the town hall, prepared to counter these arguments. Maya was the first to speak. "What's more political than telling a child they can't achieve something because of who they are?" she asked. Tanya followed, her voice calm but firm. "These changes aren't about taking away tradition. They're about making traditions better, more inclusive, and more meaningful for every child." The coalition's movement lost steam in the face of growing community support for the reforms, but Tanya remained vigilant. She knew that progress required persistence. One evening, as Tanya was cleaning up after dinner, Ava sat at the kitchen table working on a class project. She looked up and asked, "Mom, do you think things will really change forever?" Tanya paused, considering the question. "Change isn't easy and it doesn't happen all at once," she said. "But every step we take makes a difference. And if we keep speaking up and standing up for what's right, then yes, things will change." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad you didn't give up," she said. "I want to be like you when I grow up." The success of the Equity Committee's efforts began to inspire change beyond the school. Parents from neighboring districts reached out to Tanya, asking for advice on how to start similar initiatives in their own schools. The local news station, which had covered the initial controversy, aired a follow-up segment highlighting the progress that had been made. Tanya even received an invitation to speak at a statewide education conference about the importance of equity in schools. Though public speaking wasn't something she had ever imagined herself doing, she accepted, knowing that her story, and Ava's, could inspire others to take action. The Christmas play that year went ahead with the revised cast. The new director, a young teacher who had embraced the committee's recommendations, made sure every child had a chance to participate meaningfully. Tanya and Ava attended the performance, sitting near the back of the auditorium. As the play concluded with a joyful rendition of Silent Night, Tanya felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She had fought for her daughter, for other children, and for the principles she believed in. And while the journey wasn't over, this moment felt like a victory. Ava leaned over and whispered, "It's a good play, but I think our concert was better." Tanya chuckled, wrapping her arm around her daughter. "I think so too," she said. The Equity Committee's work continued into the new year, evolving into a cornerstone of the school's culture. While the initial focus had been on addressing immediate concerns, the committee quickly shifted toward building long-term solutions to ensure that every student felt valued. Tanya's role on the committee grew beyond what she had anticipated. She became a trusted voice in the community, not just for her advocacy, but for her ability to mediate tough conversations. At first, some parents who had been critical of her efforts avoided her in the halls or gave her curt nods during school events. Over time, however, they began to approach her with their own concerns, often prefacing their comments with, "I didn't understand before, but now I see why this matters." For Ava, the experience had been transformative. The pain of being sidelined during the Christmas play had given way to a newfound confidence and determination. In the spring, Ava auditioned for the school's talent show with a monologue she had written herself, a funny and heartfelt piece about finding your voice even when people try to silence you. On the night of the talent show, Tanya sat in the front row, her heart swelling with pride as Ava took the stage. Dressed in a simple outfit and holding a prop microphone, Ava delivered her performance with energy and poise. The audience laughed at her jokes, cheered at her punchlines, and erupted into applause when she finished. Backstage, Ava hugged her mother tightly. "I did it," she said, beaming. "You sure did," Tanya replied, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And I hope you never stop." Meanwhile, Maya and Carlos experienced their own moment of triumph. Carlos, encouraged by his success at the alternative holiday concert, auditioned for a competitive youth choir in the district. The process was grueling, with dozens of talented students vying for limited spots. When the acceptance letter arrived in the mail, Carlos was so nervous he handed it to Maya without opening it. She tore the envelope carefully and scanned the letter, her eyes lighting up as she read the words aloud. "Congratulations, Carlos Hernandez, on your acceptance to the district youth choir." Carlos stared at his mother, his mouth open in disbelief. "I got in," he whispered. "You got in," Maya said, pulling him into a tight hug. The choir became a turning point for Carlos. For the first time, he felt his talent recognized and appreciated. His confidence grew, and he began to see himself not just as a participant, but as someone who could lead and inspire others. Despite the progress being made, the community wasn't immune to setbacks. The Preserve Tradition Coalition, though quieter, occasionally resurfaced with petitions and social media posts calling for a return to normalcy. Tanya noticed how the language used in these campaigns often masked their true intent. Phrases like "protecting our values" and "keeping things simple" were thinly veiled attempts to push back against inclusivity. One day, Ava came home from school with a question that caught Tanya off guard. "Mom, why do some people think we're ruining things?" Tanya set down the laundry she was folding and sat beside Ava. "Change can be scary for some people," she explained. "They might feel like making things better for others means losing something for themselves. But the truth is, fairness helps everyone." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "Do we stop trying?" "Never," Tanya said firmly. "Because even if it's hard, doing what's right is always worth it." Recognizing the need to bridge the divide, the Equity Committee began hosting community events aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding. One of the most successful initiatives was a Family Stories Night, where students and their families were invited to share traditions, recipes, and stories from their cultures. The event was held in the school gym, which was transformed into a vibrant, welcoming space with colorful decorations and tables filled with food. Ava and Tanya brought sweet potato pie, a family favorite, while Maya and Carlos contributed tamales. Parents and students mingled, swapping stories and tasting dishes they'd never tried before. Ava, who had been hesitant about attending at first, found herself enjoying the evening. She even took the stage to share a story about her grandmother's role in organizing church Christmas plays, a tradition that had inspired her love of performance. By the end of the night, even some of the parents who had been resistant to the Equity Committee's efforts admitted that the event had been a success. "This is what we've been missing," one father said, shaking Tanya's hand. "Thank you for pushing us to do better." One evening, after a particularly productive Equity Committee meeting, Tanya sat on her porch with Jasmine, who had been her steadfast supporter from the start. "You've come a long way, Tanya," Jasmine said, sipping her tea. "I remember when you were just talking about writing an email, and now look at you. You've changed the whole school." Tanya chuckled. "It still feels surreal sometimes, but it's not just me, it's all of us. Maya, the other parents, even the teachers who spoke up. It's a team effort." Jasmine nodded. "Still, you started it, and Ava's going to remember this for the rest of her life." Tanya looked out at the stars, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. She thought about Ava's journey, the challenges they had faced, and the progress they had made. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. "We've still got work to do," Tanya said, her voice filled with determination. "But we're not stopping now." The work of the Equity Committee reached a critical juncture as the end of the school year approached. Dr. Carter, the newly appointed principal, announced plans for a large community event, a spring showcase to celebrate the diversity and talent of the school's students. The event would replace the traditional spring fundraiser, which had long centered on a carnival-style gathering with games and food booths. "This is our chance to highlight the incredible talents and stories of our students," Dr. Carter explained during a staff meeting. "We want everyone to feel like they belong, and what better way than to let the students take center stage?" The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Teachers like Mrs. Fields were enthusiastic, eager to help their students shine, while others were skeptical about the shift in tradition. A handful of parents complained about the change, claiming it was unnecessary. "We're overcomplicating something that used to be simple," one parent grumbled at a PTA meeting. But Tanya and the Equity Committee were undeterred. They threw themselves into planning the showcase, working closely with Dr. Carter and the teachers to ensure the event would be inclusive, exciting, and representative of the entire school community. Tanya found herself juggling multiple roles as the showcase drew nearer. Between her committee work, her job, and her responsibilities as a mother, she often stayed up late into the night drafting emails, coordinating with volunteers, and brainstorming solutions to last-minute problems. One evening, Maya called Tanya with unexpected news. "The Preserve Tradition Group is planning a boycott of the showcase," she said. "They're saying it's too political." Tanya sighed, exhaustion creeping into her voice. "Of course they are. Anything that isn't their version of normal is too political. They're also trying to convince some parents not to let their kids participate," Maya added. "If they pull it off, it could really hurt the turnout." Tanya felt a pang of frustration, but she quickly shook it off. "We'll handle it," she said firmly. "Let's focus on the families who support us. If we make this event as amazing as we know it can be, the naysayers will see they were wrong." As preparations for the showcase continued, Ava surprised Tanya by volunteering to MC the event. "I want to do it, Mom," she said confidently. "I want to help tell everyone stories." Tanya hesitated, remembering how much Ava had struggled with self-doubt after the Christmas play incident. "Are you sure, sweetheart? It's a big responsibility." Ava nodded. "I'm sure. You taught me that speaking up is important, even when it's hard. I want to show everyone that we can do this." Tanya felt a swell of pride. "Then let's practice your script," she said with a smile. As word of the showcase spread, Tanya and Maya were surprised to receive offers of help from unexpected sources. One of the more vocal critics of the Equity Committee, Mr. Jeffries, approached Tanya in the parking lot after school one day. "I've been thinking," he began, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. Maybe I was too quick to judge what you're doing. My daughter's really excited about performing in the showcase and, well, I want to help. Tanya smiled, masking her surprise. We'd love your help, she said. There's plenty to do. Mr. Jeffries ended up coordinating volunteers for stage setup and decorations, and his involvement helped sway other hesitant parents to support the event. The spring showcase arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon. The school gym transformed into a vibrant performance space. Colorful banners hung from the rafters, and the stage was adorned with a backdrop painted by the art students. Tables lining the walls showcased projects from various classes, celebrating the creativity and diversity of the student body. The event began with Ava stepping onto the stage, microphone in hand. She looked out at the packed audience, her nerves momentarily visible. Then she smiled, her voice ringing out clear and steady. "Welcome to our spring showcase," she announced. "Today, we're here to celebrate the amazing talents, stories, and cultures that make our school special. Let's make some noise for all the incredible students who worked hard to bring this to life." The audience erupted into applause, and Tanya, sitting in the front row, felt a surge of pride. The performances ranged from musical numbers and dance routines to poetry readings and skits. Carlos wowed the crowd with a powerful solo, his voice filling the gym with emotion. A group of students performed a traditional Mexican folk dance, their colorful costumes twirling under the stage lights. Another group presented a skit about friendship and acceptance, which earned a standing ovation. Midway through the showcase, Dr. Carter took the stage to deliver a brief speech. "Today is about more than performances," she said. "It's about recognizing the value of every voice, every story, and every dream. This event is proof that when we come together, we create something truly beautiful." Tanya noticed Mrs. Fields wiping away a tear, and even some of the parents who had initially resisted the showcase seemed moved by the performances. As the final act concluded, a choir performance of "Lean on Me" featuring students from every grade, the entire audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Tanya spotted Mr. Jeffries in the back of the room, smiling and clapping along. The spring showcase was hailed as a resounding success, with parents, teachers, and students praising its message and execution. Dr. Carter announced plans to make it an annual tradition, a new cornerstone of the school's culture. After the event, Ava approached Tanya with a beaming smile. "Did you see how many people were clapping, Mom?" she asked excitedly. "I saw," Tanya said, hugging her tightly. "You did an amazing job." That night, as Tanya reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The road had been challenging, but the growth she had witnessed, in Ava, in the school, and in the community, made every struggle worthwhile. The success of the spring showcase marked a turning point for the school and the community, but it also set the stage for the most dramatic moment in Tanya's fight for equity. As the new school year approached, the Equity Committee was preparing to roll out its most ambitious project yet, a revised curriculum that incorporated diverse voices, histories, and cultural perspectives. The proposed changes sparked heated debates during a town hall meeting, where parents, teachers, and community members gathered to voice their opinions. The gymnasium was packed, the air thick with tension as the discussion began. Tanya sat at the head of the room beside Dr. Carter, a folder of documents in front of her, and Ava watching from the audience with Jasmine. The first speaker, a middle-aged man who had opposed the Equity Committee from the start, took the microphone. "I don't see why we need to change anything," he said, his voice rising with emotion. "What we've been teaching works fine. All this talk of diversity is just a distraction." A murmur of agreement rippled through a small group of attendees, but Tanya noticed the majority of the room remained silent, listening intently. Tanya stood as the man returned to his seat. She walked to the microphone, her posture calm but commanding. "Thank you for sharing your perspective," she began, her voice steady. "But let me ask you this. Does fine mean that every child feels seen and valued? Does fine mean that no one is left out or overlooked?" She gestured to Ava, who sat watching her mother with wide eyes. "My daughter was told she couldn't play a role in a school play because she didn't fit the image. That's not fine. That's exclusion. And it's why we're here tonight, to create a school where every student belongs." As Tanya continued speaking, the tension in the room began to shift. Some parents nodded in agreement while others looked uncomfortable. One woman stood up abruptly, her face flushed. "This isn't about inclusion," she said sharply. "It's about forcing your agenda on the rest of us. Not everything has to change just because a few people are unhappy." Tanya felt a spark of anger, but kept her tone measured. "This isn't about an agenda," she replied. "It's about fairness. Our goal isn't to erase traditions. It's to expand them so that everyone can participate." Dr. Carter stepped in, her voice calm but firm. "We've seen the positive impact of these changes firsthand," she said. "The spring showcase brought our community together in ways we haven't seen before. This curriculum is the next step in ensuring every child feels they have a place here." The tide of the meeting began to turn when Maya stepped to the microphone, Carlos standing beside her. "I've heard people say this is about politics," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But for my son, this is about having a chance to succeed." She paused, placing a hand on Carlos's shoulder. Carlos was overlooked for years, told he didn't belong, but when he was given the chance to perform, he found his voice. That's what this is about, giving every child a chance to shine. Carlos took the microphone, his voice trembling but determined. "I used to think I wasn't good enough," he said, "but now I know I am, and I want other kids to feel that too." The room erupted into applause, and Tanya felt tears sting her eyes. As the meeting neared its conclusion, the board chair opened the floor for a final round of comments before the vote on the proposed curriculum changes. Tanya stood once more, aware that this was her last chance to make an impact. "Change is never easy," she began, "but staying silent is what allows exclusion to continue. We owe it to our kids to be brave, to face these challenges head-on, and create a better future for them." She paused, scanning the room. "Tonight we're deciding what kind of school we want to be. A school that clings to the past or one that embraces progress. I know which one I want for my daughter and for all of our children." The audience erupted into cheers and applause, drowning out the few voices of dissent. Tanya returned to her seat, her heart pounding as the board prepared to cast their votes. When the board chair finally announced the results, Tanya felt the tension drain from her body. The curriculum changes had been approved by a wide margin, a clear mandate for the Equity Committee's work to continue. Ava leapt from her seat and ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her. "You did it, Mom!" she said, her voice filled with joy. "No, sweetheart," Tanya replied, hugging her tightly. "We did it, together." In the days that followed, the victory was celebrated throughout the community. Teachers began preparing to implement the new curriculum, excited to introduce their students to a broader range of perspectives. Tanya received messages of gratitude from parents and students, many of whom shared how the changes had already made a difference in their lives. Even some of the critics began to come around, admitting that the showcase and the new policies had created a more inclusive environment for their own children. The experience inspired Ava to take on more leadership roles in school. She joined the student council and worked with her peers to organize events that celebrated diversity, including a cultural heritage day that became a beloved tradition. Watching Ava blossom into a confident and compassionate leader, Tanya felt a deep sense of pride. Her daughter's resilience and courage had been the driving force behind her fight for change, and now Ava was carrying that legacy forward. The school year ended with a sense of renewal. The changes Tanya and the Equity Committee had fought for were now woven into the fabric of the school. The new curriculum introduced fresh perspectives, celebrating voices that had long been ignored. The once divisive atmosphere had begun to transform into one of collaboration and understanding. On a warm summer evening, Tanya and Ava sat together on the porch, the hum of cicadas filling the air. Ava was flipping through a scrapbook they had started months ago, filled with photos and clippings documenting their journey. "Look at this one, Mom," Ava said, pointing to a picture of herself from the spring showcase. She was mid-speech, microphone in hand, her face glowing with confidence. Tanya smiled. "That's my favorite," she said. "You were amazing that night." Ava looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think things will stay better, or will we have to fight again?" Tanya leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "There's always more work to do," she said honestly. "But every time we speak up, we make it a little easier for the next person. And we've already shown that we're not afraid to fight for what's right." Ava nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I want to keep helping," she said, "like you do." Tanya reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You already are, sweetheart. As the summer progressed, Tanya received invitations to speak at local and statewide events, sharing her story with other parents and educators. The Equity Committee became a model for other schools in the district, inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring communities. Tanya often found herself reflecting on how far they had come. What had started as a moment of anger and heartbreak at the Christmas play had grown into something much bigger, a movement that was changing lives and building a brighter future. On the first day of the new school year, Tanya walked Ava to the front steps of the school. Parents and students milled about, greeting friends and chatting about summer adventures. Tanya noticed a new mural on the school's exterior wall, a vibrant painting depicting students of all backgrounds, standing together under a banner that read, "Every voice matters." Ava stopped to admire the mural. "It's beautiful," she said, glancing at her mom. "It is," Tanya agreed, her voice filled with pride. "It's a reminder of everything we've worked for." As Ava joined her friends and disappeared into the building, Tanya lingered for a moment, watching the bustle of the school morning. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the steps they had taken would continue to resonate long after this day. Tanya turned and walked toward her car, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight for equity was far from over, but she knew that with people like Ava, Maya, and the countless others who had joined the cause, the future was in good hands. Years later, Ava stood on a stage much larger than the one from her school days, delivering a speech to a packed auditorium. Now a young adult, she had dedicated her life to advocacy, carrying forward the lessons her mother had taught her. Tanya sat in the audience, her heart swelling with pride as Ava concluded her speech. "My mother taught me that change begins with courage. It begins with one voice willing to speak up and another willing to listen. Together, we can make the world better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The audience rose to their feet in applause, and Tanya wiped a tear from her cheek. Ava had found her voice, and she was using it to change the world. This story reflects a journey of courage, resilience, and the power of speaking out against injustice. Tanya and Ava's fight was not just about a role in a school play. It was about challenging systems that perpetuate exclusion and creating spaces where every child feels seen, valued, and celebrated. Change begins with small, brave steps. It starts when one person dares to speak up and inspires others to join. Tanya's determination and Ava's resilience remind us all that progress is possible, even in the face of resistance. Now, it's your turn to take action. Look at your community, your schools, your workplaces. Are there voices being left out? Are there systems that need to change? Whether it's advocating for equitable policies, supporting underrepresented voices, or simply listening with empathy, you have the power to make a difference. Let this story inspire you to be a catalyst for change. Share it with others, spark conversations, and take steps, big or small, toward building a more inclusive world. Every voice matters. Every action counts. What change will you fight for today?